Couple of thoughts as we get started from that. This is just free life advice. So if you're here this morning and you're single and you hope to be married someday, I love what they said. Don't settle for someone who, when Martha and I got married, one of the reasons we decided to get married is because we felt like we could do more for God and for his kingdom together than we could do apart. That's what God wants for all of us. So if you can't find somebody you can do that with, you need to keep looking, because if he's got someone for you, they're out there and they'll be different. So don't settle for anything less than that. The other thing I want to let you know is if you ever wonder why we invite you all to give, that's why, right? We don't just want your money, right? We want people to have an opportunity to find life in Jesus Christ. Right, when people give to the offering here, what they do is they make it possible for the people of Suburban to reach out and to share with others, right? Like college students who come to town thinking they're looking forward to 5 years of partying, to instead be reconnected with God in a way that transforms their life. And then we take that money and we use it to reach people, and we use it to invest in people who grew up here or in trusted partners all around the world so that more people can hear about God's good news. So when we invite you to give, we just want you to know that's what you get to be a part of. It is thrilling to be a privilege and a part of what God is doing here and around the world through people like you all. So thank you for sharing that with us this morning. For those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet before, by the way, my name is Mike King, and I'm one of the pastors up here at Suburban. And this morning, we're kicking off a new sermon series that we're calling New Year, New You. And the series is really all about how you can make lasting, positive changes in your life. And obviously, this is a great time of the year to be talking about that because, we're here, and it's the time of the year when people are thinking about New Year's resolutions. People are looking at their life, they're sort of assessing, trying to figure out what's going on. In fact, lots of people are thinking about things that we might do differently this year, including the people who program, those information signs that hang above the interstate. This is a great one that Jamie shared with me this week, right? New year, new you, use your blinker, right? Is there anybody else out there who thinks our world would be a better place if people would just go ahead and take that advice? Amen, praise Jesus, yeah. So here's the thing, as I was preparing for the sermon, thinking about kind of New Year's resolutions, I went to the source of all knowledge, Google, and tried to figure out, okay, what are some of the most common New Year's resolutions? So if you just had to guess, and this is part, I kind of want to hear your thoughts, what would you say are some of the most common New Year's resolutions that people make? Yeah, lose weight, exercise, perfect. What else? Stop smoking? Yeah. You guys are definitely on the right track. Here, this is sort of a list. We'll go ahead and put this up there. This is what Google said, so it must be true, because if it's on the internet, it's accurate. So number one, lose weight. And a lot of people said exercise or eat healthy. I just kind of lumped all those together, right? Get organized. Learn to say no. Stop smoking. Travel more. Spend more time with family and friends, or learn a new skill and hobby. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. But my guess is that an awful lot of us in this room have made one or more of these New Year's resolutions over the years, right? Because they're all examples, I think, of positive changes that people might want to make in their life. Now, personally, I did not make any New Year's resolutions this year. I have made a ton of them in the past, and I would say that honestly, probably 95% of them don't even make it to the end of the first week of January. I really struggle with change and resolutions and all of that. Just some examples of that. No more coffee. Okay, that was my New Year's resolution one year. That lasted about 6 hours after I woke up until I was just so grumpy, and my family was like, please, for the love of God, please don't do this to us. Drink coffee. Or, I don't know how many years I've thought, I want to eat better and exercise, but I end up just kind of doing what I've always doing, just sort of keeping on with that. I mean, we know, right? We know from our experience that making lasting change is just really hard to do, even when it's a good thing, even when it's a really positive change that we want to make. But there's something kind of deep inside us that wants to believe that change is possible, which is why every year about this time, a lot of us start thinking and we make some plans, we identify areas that we want to change. And my guess is that even if you didn't make a New Year's resolution this year, this sort of thought, it's just in the air right now. A lot of us are thinking about what do we hope might happen this year? What would we like to see change? And that's really what the sermon series is all about. It's just going to be looking at some really simple steps that we can take to make positive and lasting changes in our life. And the big one that I want to make sure that you hear today is I just want you to know that change really is possible. Right? It's hard to do sometimes. We sometimes have a difficult time putting it into practice and pulling it off. but real change is possible. So if you're thinking about changes that you want to make this year, that you want to see happen this year, I just want to encourage you to know that it really can be a reality for you this year. You really can change. So to get into that, to talk a little bit about how we might get there, we're going to spend some time this month looking at the New Testament letter of Colossians. And we're going to look at the words that an early Christian leader named Paul wrote about 2,000 years ago and just see how that can sort of help us as we wrestle with this idea of change today. And here's kind of what I think is a cool thing about this. The ideas that we're going to be talking about today and in this series are ideas that anybody can put into practice, whether or not you would consider yourself a Christian. Right, so today we're going to look at this really simple formula for change that Paul kind of lays out. And it's something that I think all of us can follow, even if we are not followers of Jesus. Right, so what we're going to talk about is going to be helpful for everyone. But I do think if you are a follower of Jesus, then we have access to God's power, and we can actually see change happen in areas of our life that go way beyond the normal stuff that New Year's resolutions talk about. So there's helpful information for everybody, but if you are here this morning, and maybe you wouldn't consider yourself a Christian, or you're not quite sure where you are with God, I just would encourage you to maybe keep an open mind and an open heart as we talk about this. Because if you look at these ideas through the lens of faith, I really do think you'll find that God maybe has something more for you here than what you expected you might find this morning. So what I want to invite you to do to get started is to turn in your Bibles to Colossians chapter 1. If you didn't bring a Bible with you this morning, that's not a problem. There's some red ones in the seat around you, and if it would be helpful to you for any reason, you can grab one of those and turn to the page number that's listed there on the screen. But as you're turning there, let me kind of set this up for you. So what we have in the New Testament is the book of Colossians actually began its journey as a letter. Right? It was a letter written by an early Christian leader named Paul to a young group of Christians in this Greek city-state of Colossae. Now, Paul didn't know these people. That's important to remember, and you'll see that sort of in some of the language that he uses. All throughout his life and his career, Paul planted tons of churches all around the Mediterranean basin. But he didn't plant this one. And apparently he had never actually met these people. But instead, he had a co-worker, a man named Epaphras, who was more connected with this church and a couple of other churches. And he came and was meeting with Paul, and he was kind of giving him an update on how things were going in some of these young churches. And he talks, I guess, real specifically about 3 of them. You can see them on this map. They're in the Lycus River Valley of what we would call modern-day Turkey. And they're right down there at the bottom. It's these cities of Hierapolis, Laodicea, and Colossae. So Epaphras shows up. He finds Paul, and he gives them sort of an update on how the things are going for the young Christians in these 3 churches. And it turns out from his report that it was kind of a mixed bag. I mean, some things were really going well. They were seeing growth and fruit, and it was really exciting. But Paul also gets this troubling report from Epaphras that there are these new teachers that are kind of showing up. The people who had started the church, they had moved on to start other things, and there's kind of this leadership void and vacuum. So these new teachers started showing up. And they had a message that kind of veered a little off track from the message of God. They're saying, if you really want to be in God's good graces, just accepting his grace is probably not enough. If you want to get in good with God and stay in good with God, there's probably a really long list of things that you need to do every single day. And you got to make sure you check them all off the list, or you really could find yourself on the wrong end of this equation. And when Paul hears that this is kind of the teaching that's out there, he gets alarmed. Because he realizes that this isn't true, and if the people really begin to believe this and act on this, it's going to pull them away from the life that God has for them. So he feels like it's his job, as a leader in the church, he's got to step in and address this. But since he doesn't know them, he chooses to address it by writing a letter. In fact, he actually writes a couple of letters to those different churches, and his expectation is that they would sort of share those letters with each other. And you see this as you read through the book of Colossians. You get to chapter 4, and right near the end, Paul says this. He says, after this letter has been read to you, right? Because that's how letters got passed around in the day. It would show up, and they would just sort of read it out loud to the congregation. So he says, after this letter has been read to you, see that it is also read in the church of the Laodiceans, right? Just right up the road. And that you in turn read the letter from them. So there are these multiple letters out there floating around that Paul has written to try to sort of address this problem on a couple of different fronts. So that's what's going on in the background. That's the setting that I want you to keep in mind. That's the why behind this letter. And then we're going to look together at the opening prayer of this letter. Because now for us, when we write a letter or an email today, we don't include an opening prayer in it. But that was just part of how letters got written back then. You know, you would write the name of the person you're writing, who was writing the letter, and then you would insert this little prayer. Just like we might have, dear ma'am, and start. It was just part of the format. But most of the time, the prayers in these letters were really short. It was almost like the author was like, I got to get this prayer thing out of the way so I can get to what I want to say. But Paul didn't do that, right? Paul took the fact that he kind of needed to put this prayer, and he sort of really turns it into this neat thing. Because his prayers are often a lot longer than the other prayers you see in ancient letters. And if you read them, you find that in his prayers, he's sort of giving you sneak previews of what he's going to talk about in the rest of the book. He introduces the ideas and the themes that he'll come back to later. So if you're ever reading one of Paul's letters, and there's about a dozen of them in the New Testament, that's just something to look for to help you kind of understand and get a handle on the letter. So let's look at part of this prayer, starting in verse 9, where Paul says this. He says, since the day we heard about you, right? He hasn't ever met these people. He's just heard about them. But since we've heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you. We continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through all the wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives. And this is why he's praying that. This is the end result he sees in mind. So that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you may have great endurance and patience. Now, when I read this, this time of year, thinking about change, what really jumps out at me, if you read this through this lens of change, is how much of this has to do with the change that Paul is praying will happen in the lives of these early believers, right? It's a prayer that these young Christians would continue to grow and would continue to change and would continue to become the people that they were created to be, to live the lives that God created them to live. And I think if you sort of read this together, you can actually pull out a pattern, a really simple formula that you and we can all take to begin to make positive, lasting changes in our lives. And this is it. We actually wrote it down in the sermon notes for you so you could hang on to it. But I think the pattern Paul is working at is pretty simple. He says that a commitment to living a changed life, right? You start with that commitment to change. That should lead to change behavior. And then that in turn should lead to measurable results. Right? That's, I think, what Paul understands as sort of a pattern for change in our lives. And in this prayer, he's praying that these young Christians will actually live this out. Now, we're going to spend the rest of the series kind of working through this and talking about the ideas in it and how to apply that in practical terms. But what I want to do this morning is take a couple of minutes and just go back to the actual words of the prayer so that you can see where I'm pulling this from, because these are not the words that Paul uses, even though it's the idea that I think he's getting at. So we'll walk through it just kind of a step at a time. And the first step in the process is a simple one. It's one that I think sort of intuitively we realize is true, right? If you want to change, you have to actually believe that change is possible, and then you have to commit to doing it. Right, and that idea, that's actually what Paul has been talking about in the first 8 or 9 verses of the book of Colossians. As he opens up that letter, he introduces himself, and then he just starts talking about the history of these young Christians. He reminds them about the time when they met Christ, and he reminds them that he hears good reports about them, right? He hears that the gospel has been growing and spreading among them since the day they heard, right? Remember that phrase, since the day they heard, and they truly understood God's grace. Right, what I think Paul is saying there is he's reminding these young Christians that there was a moment when the light bulb went on. Right, there was a moment when they understood. They understood who God was. They understood what Jesus had done for them. They understood the real difference that could make in their lives if they accepted that. And they led them to believe that real change in their life was possible. So they kind of heard about that. There was this moment, they believed that change could happen, and they committed their lives to him. And as a result, their behavior changed, and all these things started happening that Paul talks about. The gospel is growing and spreading, right? So for the Colossians, there is an explicit sort of spiritual dimension to this. The belief that they had was the belief that they could be put back in a right relationship with the God who created them and loved them, right? So they believed that was possible. So they accepted the offer of faith, of grace and redemption found in Jesus by faith. And then they began to commit to live differently. So this is a real spiritual example of that. But as I mentioned, this idea that we're talking about, this formula, it applies to our spiritual lives, but it can apply to anything that we want to change, all this list of New Year's resolutions. So, for example, one of the things on that list, right, that people resolve to do this time of year is that they want to stop smoking. So years ago, we were living in Tulsa, and one of the big hospital systems there decided that their entire campus was going to be smoke-free. right? For the most part, you couldn't smoke in the ER and stuff like that. But, there were in places where family members or patients or employees could go and they could take a smoke break. But it was like it just dawned on them one day, like, hey, smoking's not healthy. Maybe we shouldn't do that in a hospital. So they decided, all right, we're going to change our policy. You can't smoke anywhere on campus. But they realized that they had a bunch of employees who were used to taking their smoke break. So they said, okay, as a service to you all, we are going to offer these smoking cessation classes, free of charge. We'll hook you up with nicotine patches. We really want to help you change if you want to change. So I had a good buddy at the time who was a psychologist who was working for the health system, and they didn't have enough people to teach and facilitate these classes. So somehow he convinced them that, as a pastor, I was like almost a therapist, which is crazy. But he was like, oh, my buddy could do this. So he hooked me up, and I started teaching one of these smoking cessation classes. And let's just say there were 6 or 8 people in there. I think it's fair to say that there was a variety of beliefs and commitments to change represented in the people in the group. So, for example, there was a couple of ladies, one in particular, who really had wanted to stop smoking, and she saw this as an opportunity to do that. The hospital was going to support her. She was going to go for it. So we kind of started, and we were working through the material, and we looked at the studies that showed, yes, it is physically possible to break this sort of chemical addiction to nicotine. And we shared the stories of people's lives. Here are stories of people whose lives were changed. And for her, that was enough. She started to believe that change was possible. So she decided she was going to make a commitment to change. And it's great because the class ended, and like 2 years later, I ran into this lady at the grocery store, and she remembered me. She actually came up to me and she said, I just want you to know I'm still not smoking. I was like, that's fantastic. I had no idea who she was, and then it dawned on me. I was like, oh, right, yes, that class. I was like, I don't know, why is this random lady telling me, hey, I'm not smoking anymore? I'm like, good. No, so, it was great, but not everybody in the class felt that way. There was one gentleman in particular who, walked in the first day. He's kind of doing one of these things. And basically he says, I'm here because my boss told me I had to come. I just got to log the right number of hours and then I'm done with this. And for him, we looked at the studies and said, yeah, it's physically possible to do this. And he just didn't believe it. He's like, you know what? That may be true for other people, but I can't even tell you how many times I've tried to quit smoking. It has never worked for me. I just don't think that's possible for me. And the last memory I have of that guy, when the last class ended, I walk out to the parking lot and I see him get into his car, light up a cigarette, and drive out of the parking lot. And as far as I know, he's probably still smoking, right? Because if you don't believe that change is possible and you never make a commitment to change, guess what? You're never going to change, right? That's just the first step in the process. But as Paul's prayer shows, that commitment, committing to change, believing it's possible, that's a critical first step, but it is not the end of the story. It's not the end of the journey, right? Let's go back to that formula for a minute. So that commitment to living a changed life, that should lead to changed behavior, which then in turn is going to lead to measurable results, right? This commitment has to lead to changed behavior, right? And again, it's so obvious, like we almost don't even need to say that. We get that that's true. Like the lady in the group who wanted to quit smoking, it wasn't enough to just commit. Eventually she had to change what she did. She had to stop buying cigarettes at Quick Trip on the way home every day, right? She had to actually get the nicotine patches from the hospital and go through the process of sort of tearing the dosage down so she could wean herself off of that. I remember we were talking about things that she could do to sort of make the change lasting in her life, and she said, I've got some coworkers, and most days after our shift, we stop by the bar and we smoke together while we have a drink before I go home. If I really want to stop smoking, I probably need to stop doing that. I need to avoid the places and the times when people are going to be encouraging me to do that. Right? She realized that the commitment to change had to lead to change behavior. And again, I think we know this is true in all areas. We've probably all got examples of this. Again, for us, one that I think about 10 years ago when our identical twins were about 3 years old. No, not 3 years old. They're 10. 3 months old, right? Sorry. We've got 4 kids. It's hard to keep them apart. So they were about 3 months old. And, twins are hard when they're little, right? One baby is hard. Imagine a second one. And Martha did absolutely all of the work, but I really feel like I did more than my share of the suffering in the process. So it was hard for me too. But no, so at the end of those 3 months, right, the new year rolls around, and we're just trying to survive. Like, we weren't going to the gym. We're just eating anything that we can see in this effort to stay alive and make it to the next day. But nevertheless, it was New Year's resolution time, and I was like, well, I'm going to get in shape. But, I didn't have the energy to do anything differently. So I didn't go to the gym. I didn't change what I was eating. Guess what happened? Nothing. Yeah, nothing happened, right? Nothing changed at all. It was like a year later when I was like, maybe I should eat vegetables again, that things kind of started turning the corner. But we just know if we make a commitment to change, but we don't change our behavior, it's not going to go anywhere. And all throughout this letter, right, all throughout the letter of Colossians, you see that language. Paul talks about it over and over again. For example, early on in the letter, he really applauds the young Christians in Colossae. He says, you guys are doing great things. You've changed your behavior. And he encourages them to keep it up. He says he wants you to continue to live your lives in him, right? Continue to do those new behaviors that help you stay rooted and built up in him. Continue to do these new behaviors that keep you strengthened in your faith. That idea even comes up in the little prayer that we read together this morning, where he says this. Paul prays they would continue bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you may have great endurance and patience. Right? That good fruit that Paul is talking about, it's what happens as a result of their changed behavior. And Paul gets so practical in this letter, right? Near the end of the letter, there are long passages where he starts talking about, hey, if you make a commitment to follow Christ and live differently, here's how you should treat your wife differently. Here's how you should start saying different kinds of things to your kids. Here's how that should show up in the office and the workplace. Here's how that should change the way that you use the power and the responsibility that you have. Right? Paul gets very, very practical. Some of it's actually a little bit uncomfortable, which is why we will actually talk about it. But it's the thing, right? You know, it's this idea that if you really want to change, your behavior has to change or it's not going to get you anywhere. And that idea actually leads to the last part of this little formula that Paul lays out. Right, that commitment to change leads to changed behavior, and that's going to lead to measurable results. And the measurable results that Paul talks about, he talks about that in terms of the fruit of their life, right? As you're doing things differently, that should show up in visible and measurable ways, the way that you interact with people. I mean, we're going to talk about that more in the weeks to come, but the idea behind it is pretty simple, right? As you commit to change, and as you actually change your behavior, the end result of that should be some things that you could look at and measure so that you can understand, am I moving towards the goal or not? Right? And I think that's wonderful. I think it's really helpful that we can have some things that we look at and measure so that we know if the changes that we made are the right changes, if they're the changes that are actually moving us towards the goal we have in the life that we have. Right? You see that with New Year's resolutions all over the place, right? If you decide, okay, my goal this year, I want to spend more time with my family and friends, right? You can measure that. You can look at your calendar for the first week of February and compare it to your calendar for the first week of January and say, did I make family and friends a priority? Did I make the decisions, change the decision-making behavior so that I'm actually doing what I say I'm going to do? Right? If you want to lose weight, you can weigh yourself every week and see which direction the number is moving in. Right? If your commitment is to travel more, you can get your passport out in a year and see if you've got more stamps in that bad boy now than you did a year ago. Right? We can measure how we're doing. And that, right, this pattern that Paul is talking about, he talks about it all over. It's kind of his operating pattern that he uses throughout this book. Now, at this point, there is a very good chance that some of you at least are sitting there thinking, yeah, I know, right? I feel like I've just wasted 20 minutes of my life. This is very simple, Mike. This is very obvious. You were talking about change. I showed up today. I was hoping for this revolutionary new insight or teaching that I could use to just really get a handle on some things. But this I could have told you, right? This I already know. Well, here's the thing. I know that none of this is really groundbreaking. And that's kind of the point. Like, that's part of why I wanted to talk about that today. It's part of why I think Paul wants to talk about it. Because it turns out that we all know that the process that we need to go through to change is not difficult, right? It's not difficult to understand. It's not hard to understand what we need to do to change. It's just hard to actually do it, right? And it's hard to actually do it because, as one author puts, all of us, you and me included, we're basically just liars. And that is, we are people who live in a low information to action ratio world, right? We just know a lot more than we ever act on. I mean, think about it. If you have got a smartphone, you have access to like most of the information that has ever existed in the world ever. So we know a lot of stuff, but we just don't always have the gumption to act on it or to do things differently. So that's part of the goal this morning, is just to remind you, look, it's not that change is complicated, but we just need to remember that there's some simple steps that we already know how to do that can help us move to where God wants us. but we need to be encouraged to actually do and act on what we already know. And it's here that I think Christians, followers of Jesus, have a tremendous advantage when it comes to making positive change in our life. I mentioned at the beginning of the sermon, this is kind of an all-play topic, right? All of us, if we're looking to make changes in our lives, we can take this formula and we can put it into practice. So for example, if you want to stop smoking or eat better or get organized this year, this pattern will actually help you do that. It'll help you move towards it. But here's the thing. When Paul sat down 2,000 years ago to write this letter, he really wasn't trying to write a self-help book. It's not like Paul was sitting there and he's like, what are 3 easy steps that people could use to really create healthy boundaries in their life and lose weight and exercise more? No, that's not his main goal, right? His ultimate goal is to help all people realize that the only way to live the full and free life that they were created to live is to find hope and forgiveness and new life in a relationship with Jesus Christ. Right? That's the goal for him. Everything else grows out of that and flows out of that. And that's why, for me, the heart of this letter, if you had to take the whole letter to the Colossians and pick out one phrase that sums it all up, for me, I find that in Colossians 3:16, where it says this. It says, let the message about Christ in all its richness fill your lives. Right? Let the message about Christ in all of its richness fill your lives. I love that verse. In fact, every morning when I get up and I read and I pray, the material I use to do that, I have that verse written down in there so I can remind myself every day, this is the goal, right? This is what I'm praying towards. This is what I'm reading towards. This is what I'm living towards. I want the message of Christ in all its richness to impact every part of my life today. But to me, at least, that kind of begs the question, right? What does the message of Christ in all of its richness mean? Now, I believe that part of the message of Christ and all of his richness, part of what it is that God wants for us, it does involve things like being healthy, right? Taking care of our bodies, being in healthy relationships with people, having good boundaries, all the stuff that your New Year's resolutions tend to kind of address. But it goes so much deeper than that. Right? It really, at its core, it involves being put back in a right relationship with the God who loves us and the God who created us. You see, I think if you take Paul's formula and decide that you just want to use it as sort of a 3-step, sort of personal self-help kind of thing, you can do that. But you are really missing out on his main point. You are missing out on what is most important for him. Because for Paul, the only way to truly enjoy the fullness of life, to really enjoy the full and the free life that we were created to live, is to recognize that we can't fix ourselves. Right, to recognize that we are just more broken than we're ever going to know, but that we are more loved by God than we can ever imagine. And the way that you start, right, the way that you start is by accepting his offer of grace and forgiveness and coming back into that right relationship with him. And then every other good thing we want to see in our life flows out of that. Yes, health and good relationships, all those things, they're important. They are part of the full life God wants us to have. But it starts with that relationship with God. And that's for Paul what is central that we've got to understand, that when we are put back in a right relationship with our God, every other part of our lives can be refreshed and can be restored. So what about you? What changes do you feel like you might need to make this year? Now, it could be that you're here this morning and you are already a follower of Jesus. Maybe you've been doing that for a long time. So the change that you need to make is not that core change, right, of being put back in a right relationship with God. But, we've all got areas where we want to change, where we want to see some growth. So for you, maybe what you need to do is really think and pray, okay, how do I apply this formula to my life, to where I am, to the specific issue that comes to mind for you? Maybe you're here this morning and you're not interested in God and you just got some New Year's resolutions that you want to work on, right? Take this formula and use it. But if you're here this morning and you wouldn't consider yourself a Christian, I guess I would just encourage you to stop and think, maybe today is a day that you need to realize that you're never going to fix things if you're just dealing with stuff on the surface level. That the problem behind the problem that you deal with is maybe this brokenness in your own relationship with God. And I just want you to know that if you're interested in talking with someone about that or praying with someone about that, in fact, this is for everybody. When you leave today, when the service ends, if you head out through those doors and take a right, we've got a prayer room. And we have some folks in there who would love to pray with you about that. Whether that's talking about what it looks like to meet Jesus for the first time, or just to take these ideas and apply it to see positive change in any area of our life, that's really part of what we're here for, to encourage you in that and support you in that. And we would consider it a real privilege to be able to pray for you in that. But change is possible, right? Real, positive, lasting change is possible for you and for me, for all of us. And that is part of what the message of Christ in all its richness is really about. And because of that, we felt like it was really fitting to end our time together this morning by taking communion together. Because communion is something that we do here at Suburban each and every week, because it reminds us that the real presence and the real power of God is alive and at work. It's here. It's available to us to help us live the lives he created us to live, to help us change and leave sinful behaviors in the past and to move into the life that he wants us to live. Right? The bread and the cup that we're about to take, that is food for the journey to which God has called us. And that journey involves moving towards him and living the full, free life that he created us to live. So in just a moment, I'm going to pray, and then the ushers will come forward. They'll pass the trays, and would encourage you to take the bread and the cup and use this time to reflect. If you choose not to take communion with us this morning for any reason, that's totally fine. You can just kind of pass the tray along. But would still invite you to take the time, as there's some music playing, to just talk with God in whatever way is going to be most helpful to you, and reflect on what it might look like for his presence and his power to show up in the areas of your life this year that might need